Welcome back for part 2 of the front strut replacement. I removed all the components, placing them upside down in order. Then I removed the spring, setting it on the other side of the garage. Alright, so here's the new sack strut for the driver's side. The part number is 312139. The passenger side is 312138. It's nearly identical to the Honda strut, except that the lower mount is more shallow. This should make it easier to replace the strut if there's a next time. The nut is also included in the box. I'm going to reuse the boot bump stop combo, so we'll pull it off and set it aside. Testing the strut. Yeah, that's terrible. We're going to test the new strut before installing all the components. Resistance and rebound are good. Okay, let's install the components onto the new strut. The bump stop is first. While we're at it, I decided to replace the top mount also. Part number is 802896. There's the bearing. Mount. There are washers included in the kit, but I'm going to reuse at least the cup washer that goes over the boot. I also have a new cushion from Honda. Part number is 51402-S3V-A01. It's not really necessary to replace these parts unless they're damaged. We'll add the spring onto the strut. Next, I'm going to install the cushion onto the top mounting plate. I transfer the location of the impression of the top end of the spring onto the new cushion, then place it on the plate, pulling up on the cushion's nubs to secure it in place. I set the plate and cushion on the spring, pressing it down firmly. The bearing goes on next. I transfer the mark from the original top mount to the new mount and set it in place, lining up the marks I made earlier. Again, it's best to use the bottom end of the spring as a reference. Mark, mark, FR, lines up with this nub here. The new strut shaft is a little shorter than the original, so I press down on the stack as I continue to add components. I add the new top washer, then the new nut, which barely fit. I tighten the nut with a 17mm wrench until the shaft started spinning. Then I use a 6mm open end wrench to hold the shaft steady while I tighten the nut. Eventually, I just switched to the impact driver to make it easier, tightening the nut until about 4 threads were exposed above it. This didn't prove to be tight enough, as you'll see later. Alright, so now that the nut is tight, we'll reverse the process and remove the W80055 compressors first with the large adjustable wrench. Next, I install the plastic cover on the upper section of the spring. Then I remove the other set of spring compressors with 19mm wrenches. You may want to add some adhesive or RTV to reattach the cover. To finish this off, I reinstalled the lower plastic cover. We're going to take a quick break in the action, and I thought I'd show you an issue I ran into with the passenger side strut. Strangely, the strut on the driver's side was made in Japan and was nearly identical to the original. But the passenger side strut was made in China, and the bracket was not fabricated correctly. I had to use a little persuasion to flatten out the edge of the bracket so the bolt would fit. Barely, we'll call it. So back to our program, let's go ahead and finish up this job. Don't forget to remove the plastic sleeves covering the top mount studs. I routed the strut back into place on the knuckle, then attempted to install at least one bolt. It was like a wrestling match. What I found worked well for me was to rest my thigh against the wheel to hold it vertical, then slide the bolt in place and repeat for the bottom bolt. We're going to work on the top mount alignment and fasteners next. I placed my jack under the ball joint that jacked up the suspension until the studs were close to the holes under the cowl. Pretty dang close to being right on. I then turned the top mount a few degrees to perfectly line up the studs with the holes, then jacked up the suspension until the mount hit the underside of the cowl. The upper strut nuts go on next. I tried to avoid opening up the cowl, which you will see later was ultimately necessary. I used the magnet to start the nuts on the studs, gently swiping the magnet off the nuts once they grabbed a couple threads. I tighten the nuts just hand tight with a 14mm socket for now. The stabilizer link will go on next, just getting it hand tight with a 17mm socket and a 19mm wrench. Back to the lower mounting bolts, I threaded on the nuts by hand for now. To tighten all the fasteners, I jacked up the car until the weight was off the jack stands. Then I tightened the 14mm top nuts to 33 foot-pounds. Slot it in over here. Slot it in over here. Slot it in over here. The 22mm lower mounting nuts to 116 foot-pounds. And I would advise using two hands and keeping your elbows close to your body when you tighten the lower nuts. The stabilizer link is tightened to 58 foot-pounds using a 17mm socket and a 19mm wrench. The brake line's bolt is 12mm. I just tighten it by feel. And the sensor line's bolt is 10mm. Again, I just tighten it by feel. As I left the driveway to take the car for a test drive, I heard clunking and rattling noises and immediately turned around. What had happened is that the nut on the driver's side was shorter than the OEM-like nut on the passenger side, so I didn't think to tighten it further than the 4 threads. When the spring compressed, a gap formed between the top washer and the top mount. So I had to remove the clips holding the top half of the cowl in place with some needle nose pliers, then tighten the nut with a 17mm wrench. An adjustable wrench was needed to hold the strut center shaft steady. A 17mm ratcheting wrench with a shallow head would work best. Alright, so there you have it. There's replacing the struts on the 2004 Honda Pilot. And as you saw, the Performance Tool compressors worked extremely well. The second side was a breeze to do. I got that done very quickly. And so hopefully that part of the video helped you out. The other thing is, I was a little disappointed that the sack struts, one of them was Chinese, the other one was Japanese. The struts on the RL are all either USA or Japanese, and they fit very well. That second one from China, I don't know what happened there. That was really disappointing. So the sack struts is what I normally use on the Acura and Honda cars when I can. As I talked about before, I saw an Eric the Car Guy video a number of years ago where he talked about sack struts being a comparable replacement to the OEM struts. Now, there are other ones out there like KYBs you can also look at, but these have worked very well for me over the years, so I've always stuck with those. So hopefully this information was helpful, and thanks for watching.